hi all. Welcome back to the HR Talks, Journey to Success, a series of my job to share about your insights and success stories in tech hiring. In a previous episode, we explored strategies for rapid hiring without compromising on quality, a tactic that has proven highly effective for startups with a clear understanding of the business growth and hiring requirements. However, today we shift our focus to a different challenge faced by startups. They struggle to find the right fit candidate where, their orientation and needs may not be well defined. For these companies, navigating the hiring landscape can be daunting as they seek individuals who can contribute effectively to the growth despite the absence of clear hiring roadmap. And in the the episode today, we'd like to introduce a special guest speaker who have years of experience in building tech team from the very first stage. So let me introduce CJ Looi, who is the CEO of hiring of PixCap. I know you have a lot of success. I know you have the insights from building PixCap from the beginning 3 years back when you have the ideas for 3D without a lot of design, etc. And you have successful in fundraising and building the and building the team, not only the team but also global expansion, fundraising, product development, sales generation, and a lot more going on, right? So nice to meet you and nice to have you there. If you like to extend my congratulations on this, give a few introduction about yourself, your success, how you built the team there, that would be great to our audience.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks a lot for the intro, Mai. And so I think just a little bit of background about what we do. So PixCap is effectively building a much simpler platform for 3D design. And so one of the interesting things is that if you speak to a lot of graphic designers today, most of them do not really have the skills to create 3D. I mean, they can learn Blender, they can learn Maya, but those are generally speaking quite difficult to learn. And so a lot of designers, graphic designers, they tend to avoid 3D, but generally a lot of the trend points towards 3D being more and more popular, right? So if you look at a lot of the biggest brands today, like Microsoft, Apple, even especially in fintech, if you look at Wise, Revolut, if you look at e-commerce within the region, if you look at Lazada, Shopee, they're starting to use a lot of 3D icons here and there, right? And so the reason is because 3D icons, 3D design is more aesthetically engaging compared to 2D. So if you look at a lot of the metrics, 3D designs are generally seen as more engaging, they're newer, they're more modern. And you can also use 3D in advertising and animation because 3D is more like the real world, you can mimic it. It's much harder to do that for 2D based traditional stock vectors and things like that. And so what we're trying to do is that we want to make 3D design a lot more accessible. And I think a good analogy for that would be similar to Canva for 3D. So Canva made design a lot more accessible. And we think we want to make 3D design far more accessible by having something that's web-based, having a lot of templates on our website. If you can see, we have a lot of beautiful 3D assets on the website, and also something that's very easy to use and very easy to edit. So I hope that was a helpful introduction.
Yep, it was great to hear your story, right? The insights of making 3D design more accessible to everyone, not necessarily someone who has, superstar 3D background. And especially, it's I just have a research at it. It's a lot of, it's a lot expensive to spend for like 3D design, right? It was so insightful. Do you mind going through a little bit about your teams, like how you build it? How has it evolved from the early stage, let's say 3 years back when you and your best friend built the company until right now when you are kind of growing and scaling stage?
Yeah. So hiring has always been our biggest priority and one of our biggest challenges as well. In fact, hiring and managing a remote team is probably the most difficult part of my job, I would say. Definitely a lot harder than fundraising, absolutely, right? So, one of the things that we did when we started out was that, we actually initially wanted to set up in Singapore. So because our company is based in Singapore. Now, one of the biggest problems is that, first of all, the salary in Singapore is much higher, right? And so the cost would go up. But I think the main thing is that we couldn't really find the talent we wanted in Singapore, especially because we're doing something that's relatively niche, so to speak. Like it's a 3D engineering, we're looking for WebGL. So it's quite different from a lot of the other engineering roles out there. And so we wanted a base where we could effectively hire a lot of the best 3D talent. And that meant that, looking beyond Singapore and looking remotely, right? And so remote wasn't exactly by choice. I mean, it was something that we thought, we didn't think remote was like feasible at first, but then over time, as we hired more and more remote, we realized, what, this is something that we can make work. And now the team is pretty much fully remote. We have people from UK, Italy, the US, Russia. Previously, we had people from China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia as well. And so, we hire across fairly globally. And yeah, so I would say we're proud to represent many, many nationalities and countries within the team. We value diversity a lot, diversity of thought and transparency. And yeah, so when we first started out hiring, we hired remotely, and we face a lot of different challenges. I mean, we still face a lot of challenges, right? But one of the biggest challenges has always been hiring people that would be a good culture fit, especially in a remote environment. So in a remote team, it's extremely, extremely important to have people who infuse energy into the team instead of are very passive or take energy out, right? And so that theme of hiring very, very driven people and organized people that you want in your team, high energy, remains I would say the main thing across the entire the way that what we're looking for in candidates, right? And so that's one of the biggest things, and trying to filter for that has always been very, very tough. So how do you tell in an interview or through the resume if somebody is extremely driven and extremely high impact and highly motivated? It can be quite tough. So we do ask a few different questions that I can talk about later. But yeah, so on top of figuring out whether they're truly motivated or not, it's also about hiring for different roles, right? So certain different roles, marketing, for example, it's generally a lot more difficult to hire marketing. In fact, if you look at a lot of startups, marketing is one of the highest turnover roles that you can find, right? And then the other thing would also be a lot of front-end engineers. I mean, these days, a lot of people can call themselves front-end engineer, but are they really good is a whole other thing. So, trying to filter out for those things effectively and cost efficiently, that's something that we're always looking to improve on. So I think that gives you a sort of summary and high level of what some of the challenges are. Yeah, so I'm happy to actually answer more questions.
Sounds great, CJ. Understand, right? So at different stage of the companies, you have different focus, but still the main challenges, the main priority is not only fundraising money, sales, but also having a strong foundation, having a strong team members to support you along the way, right? And I understand as a CEO, you wear different hats into the company, right? Not only hiring, but as you've mentioned, how to make sure that is the right fit candidate, how to make sure he has the motivation needed, especially in the remote environment, right? So I totally understand. Going deeper into what you have mentioned, remote work is not only the choice, but it's also what fits with the business situation right now. And the second one is how to make sure that candidates is the right fit from this, from just first impression or just 2 or 3 rounds of interview. And just want to go deeper with it. From your experience, how do you make sure that a candidate is a good fit for an organization?
Yeah, so the main thing that we look for, obviously, assuming that the experience is there and the skills are there, right? Now, we don't necessarily look for people who are super experienced. They can be slightly inexperienced and junior, but as long as they show a desire to learn. So we look for people who are extremely hungry and they want to improve themselves. So, it could be whether it's people who maybe they want to do a startup later and they want to join a startup to learn the skills. Those people are great fits for us because, they're extremely hungry. They want to learn a lot and they don't have to be micromanaged, right? In a remote team, the moment you start micromanaging people, it becomes a lot harder because, remote is something where people can easily, I would say, take advantage of and just appear online, but then they don't actually do anything. And so just having around managing a remote team is already very difficult. And so you want to make sure that, again, prevention is better than cure, right? So you want to prevent those kind of people from joining your team because if they do join your team, then you need to start curing it and start like, putting a lot of energy, getting them to work. And so we've had a lot of difficulty, I wouldn't say difficulty, but a lot of interesting challenges in hiring people from all sorts of different cultures, right? So if you think about remote, so one of the biggest things about remote is that you can hire people from Vietnam, Indonesia at the same time, all the way in the US maybe, or maybe somewhere in Europe. Everybody has very different shared cultures, right? So in the West, it's extremely different from the culture in Asia, for example. So one very good example is in the West, people are very, very good at selling themselves and talking and just communicating, and they're very much very direct. So you compare that with people, let's say in Southeast Asia, people are generally more modest, they're more humble, and they don't exactly like to talk a lot about their achievements in a way that makes them look good. And so often what we see is that, we see a lot of candidates who they can sell themselves, but then when it comes to like actual execution, there's like a whole question mark. At the same time, you see a lot of very, very strong candidates in, for example, in Vietnam or in, we have some of the best hires ever from Vietnam. Very, very happy to hire from there. And then, these folks, they're not exactly outspoken, but they can actually, they're hardworking, right? So we look for people who are hardworking, but they also, generally they care, right? They want to make a difference and they want to learn, right? They're not just there to do a 9 to 5, right? Like, I mean, we are a startup, so like we don't really hire people who just want to get a 9 to 5 and like go home. We hire people who want to learn and contribute and want to do something impactful, or at least how can we help them to do something impactful in their careers, right? So it doesn't matter if after they join us, they go to do a startup or something like that. And in fact, like people who want to do a startup later have often been some of our best hires because they are extremely driven. And so yeah, we kind of like recognize that. And yeah, so I would say just mainly hiring for people who just care and they just want to do and learn. People who are hungry.
Yep. Thank you so much. I do think you have shared the very interesting but insightful one that you just addressed, right? When coming to startup hiring, as you mentioned, not someone who's very good at selling themselves from the first stage, mentioned a lot of things they could do, any success they could have given to your company. But a lot of people, they're not really great at selling, but they are truly driven people. They are very goal oriented and have great mission, and especially when it comes to a personality, it's hardworking, the most important thing, right? It's not someone who could work 9 to 5 and receive the payroll, but importantly to really make an impact to your company and beyond that, make an impact to the society, to the community, the SaaS community. That's great. Got it. Typically, in your opinion, what is the question? I should paraphrase it in a very convenient and easy way to elaborate. And as you have mentioned, for startup hirings, you typically look for driven and goal oriented people. How do you find those people? Like, do you source themselves? Do you have someone to do that for you? Do you spend time for those? And I know you also outsource those function to the agency. How does that work?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of success with I think using headhunters. So recruiters who find a lot of talent within different parts of the world. So yeah, I think, and we also use LinkedIn recently. We used LinkedIn a lot, and LinkedIn has been quite helpful. So in terms of channels, yeah, recruiters, LinkedIn, and I'll say those are the main ones, right? In terms of how we filter out whether a candidate has drive and motivation, I think we tend to ask a few different questions. One of the most interesting ones that we ask is like, what do you do in your free time, right? So if the person, for example, if they say, they like to code or they like to build things in their free time, and then they can show a great, interesting GitHub repository, then that's an extremely, extremely good sign for an engineer, right? Similarly for like, I would say for marketers and things like that, if they're always reading about new things, it doesn't have to be about marketing. It could be just about general things. If they're always reading, it means that they're always curious. And so we tend to like to ask people what they do in their free time, because that tells a lot about somebody what somebody does and somebody's work ethic in many ways. The other thing that we like to ask, which is somewhat a bit like less also, yeah, so somewhat slightly more controversial, especially in like this whole work-life balance movement thing, is that we like to ask what are their thoughts on working on weekends. Now, we don't expect them to work on weekends, right? But hearing the answer to this has often given us a good indicator of whether this person is willing to put in the extra amount, right? Now, let's say when they're required to maybe ship something by a deadline, are they able to put in the effort instead of like just saying, yep, it's a 9 to 5, I'm out, right? Especially in a startup, because that's extremely important, right? Okay, I understand in a big company, everybody has clearly defined roles and you just do your task and then you check in, check out. Okay, that's totally fine. But in a startup, like if everybody does it, then you lose the advantage of a startup, which is all about speed and execution, right? That's the only thing that you have over a big company is speed and execution and time. Like you guys can spend more time to execute and outspeed the big competition, right? And so we try to look for evidence of that in those kind of questions, right? So weekends are like a good example of, and if they say, oh, I don't want weekends, I want my 9 to 5, then of course, then maybe that's not such a good fit for us as a startup, but maybe a better fit for a bigger company, right? For example. And another question that we like to ask is like, what are some of your values, right? So we like to ask candidates, what do they believe in and why do they work, right? Like, why do they want to do work? And so, people who say, yeah, I want work-life balance. Okay, maybe not such a good fit for us, but people who say, look, I'm here to learn. I want to contribute to something and I want to build stuff because building stuff is fun and it's cool and it's rewarding. Then those are people that, that might be really, really good fits for startups, right? And often those are the kind of people who end up doing great things, right? Who, just having that internal drive and motivation to always do better and always improve. Those are the guys who excel anywhere, even in a big company. Those are the guys who excel anywhere. And so we are looking for those kind of folks. And we look for the folks who may not be super experienced, right? People from like Google and Meta, they look good on paper, but actually a lot of them, they're very used to do like the corporate way of doing things. And so they're very, and they get, from what we've interviewed, like a lot of them like may not be the best fit for us, but we look for people who are like relatively inexperienced or ideally they're experienced, but even if they're relatively inexperienced, it's okay as long as they can show the desire to learn.
Okay, sounds like a great insight, right? As you've shared, and always look for evidence in the conversation, not like someone who say, hey, I am very passionate, I'm willing to learn, but in the conversation, it's like, I want to work 9 to 5. It's probably...
Yeah. I mean, anybody can say they're passionate and they want to learn, but then, the question is whether can they actually do it. So you ask questions about their actual, the things that they actually do week in, week out, and that kind of reveals a lot more.
Yep. I do think that's so insightful, not only for myself, I see that insightful, but it's also helpful for job seekers who are looking to find the best fit for them, but also startup founders who look for the best fit, like someone very proactive, someone who could grow and could learn from the startup. I do think that's insightful, right? And all those, so to put it in a summary, it's just look for someone and just see the evidence in the answer.
Yeah, and look, often startups don't exactly have the luxury, unlike big companies, right? Big companies have the luxury of having very talented people join them as well. Startups usually don't have the luxury of having a big access and talent pool to choose from. And so they're not going to get very, very experienced people and very, very driven people. Like those people are extremely rare. So often they either get very experienced people who are not so motivated, or they get extremely inexperienced people. Well, I wouldn't say inexperienced, but like people who are relatively junior, but they're extremely motivated. And so you often want to look for those, right? Like, because I think motivation is like a multiplier of experience, right? So if you look at experience on a scale, like, like bits, right? So like, motivation is like a 10x multiplier on top of that. So having somebody who's truly motivated and driven can often make up for their lack of experience elsewhere, right? And I think that has been extremely true. So I can tell you the flip side, which is hiring a very experienced person with no motivation. So we've done this quite a lot of times, and more times than we would like to admit. And so a lot of these folks, they don't end up, none of them end up being at a company. And so these folks, we have people from like very, very amazing backgrounds, like, whether it's from Meta and Google or, like very, very top universities, right? Like in India, for example, IIT is one of them. So a lot of these folks, that look good on paper might end up being pretty bad fits for your company and not doing anything, right? So we had one guy who looked amazing on paper. He was from like a top university. He went to a great company. He even did a startup. And that startup got acquired by a 3D company. Great fit on paper, right? Like sounds like it checked all the boxes. But then when he joined us, he just didn't have the motivation. And so like, I kid you not, this guy, highest paid guy because of how well he looked on paper. And he only stuck with us we had to fire him within 2 weeks because he only contributed 1 line of code. So like a guy like that who's so experienced and like so amazing on paper contributes only 1 line of code in 1 month. That kind of tells you, right? Like this guy was not motivated at all. And he was just there for maybe the paycheck. And so you need to be able to filter out these kind of folks. A lot of them are like that. And you filter them out by asking those questions that I mentioned earlier.
Okay, that's great. Again, right. So not really.
Yeah, so in fact, this example, right? This guy, the red flag was, we asked him, what are your thoughts on like work-life balance? And he was like, yeah, I need my work-life balance. Okay, like, look, if you want your work-life balance, don't join a startup, okay? Don't join us, right? We don't want folks like that, okay? It's fine. Now, that's not to say that you're not going to have work-life balance in PixCap. Like a lot of the folks in PixCap have work-life balance, right? Like they have a lot of that. It's just like the attitude has to be there, right? So we try to give work-life balance to a lot of people, like especially the ones who are good, right? But if somebody says, yeah, I need my work-life balance and like, I don't want to go beyond 9 to 5, then that's not a good fit for a startup. And this guy was that. And we went against our gut instinct. We was like, you know what, this guy is so good on paper, let's hire him. But sometimes you have to trust your gut, right? Sometimes your gut tells you, man, maybe this guy doesn't really care about your company and he's just here because he looks good on paper. And so, yeah, sometimes you just have to trust your gut. If you feel like this person is maybe might not be maybe super like, go-getter, somebody who's like always driven, then, trust your instinct sometimes. They're often more right than they're wrong.
I got it. Nice to hear. Whatever the strategy it is, but the most important thing is to to hear your gut and understand that if that guy is the criteria you're looking for, right? Someone just coming in, get a paycheck like someone you just mentioned. And I feel like at some point for senior people who are very senior, it's just that the motivation to work is not necessarily tied to what startup could do. They just want some just casual job, normal job, and get paycheck, and that's it. That's the motivation in life too. Got it. It's nice. Yep, I got it. Just it's not really tied to the question we have asked earlier. But it just came up into to my mind. I have tossed about it a little bit. Thinking of the benefits a startup and a corporation can offer. It's a huge gap. It's a huge difference. No matter what the motivation is, no matter how willing to learn, how willing you love to work in a startup, you still have to pay your bill. You still have to care.
Yes.
Someone still.
Well, okay, that's assuming that the startups can offer a competitive pay. First of all, startups can offer competitive pay these days, right? Especially that more and more startups are getting before the funding winter recently. Startups they do offer competitive pay, and so it's not that. So I don't think the notion that joining a startup would mean that you're getting a pay cut. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true anymore, right? Like you have a lot of startups that can offer competitive salaries, and we try to do that as well. So going to your thoughts about like joining a big company versus a startup, I think it's really about like, I think mostly again it goes back to work-life balance, right? If you want work-life balance, then join a big company. They can take care of you, and you don't have to do that much. Like frankly speaking, more often than not, you're not going to do that much, especially if you start off as a relatively junior role at a big company. Because again, big companies, they have so many talented people, and they can effectively delegate tasks, and they're a very, very well-run machine, right? Now you join a startup, it's a lot more chaotic, it's a lot more less organized than a big company, but over there you get to, I would say, be given a lot more responsibilities, and be given a lot of autonomy in some ways. Obviously, assuming you're a good performer, you'll be given autonomy. And you might have to wear many different hats, which to a lot of people, especially who are eager to learn and they want to do something different and they want to have some variety in their work, that's a big selling point, right? I think the biggest misconception about joining a startup is, again, like the pay thing, but I would say it's also the risk. If you join a startup, there's really very little risk. I mean, again, times have changed and startups are becoming more and more common. And I think like the risk of a startup going under, yes, that's always there. But again, like employers, they look at your experience and they see, hey, if you join a very interesting startup building a cool product and you managed to learn a lot, you got promoted a few times, that's an extremely good sign. And sometimes even better than like somebody who was just like stuck at a big company for like 5 years in the same position, right? So like one of the best things about startup is relatively small and relatively I would say it's relatively chaotic. That's true compared to big companies, but in that chaos you can also have more opportunities, right? So the chaos breeds opportunity, right? So I think if you really want to learn and build something impactful, there's a much higher chance of doing that in startups versus a big company where things are extremely well defined and it's very hard to move beyond what you're asked of.
Yep, that's great. It's I understand with you. It's not the notion, the perception about startup hiring and corporation hiring and competitive benefit, etc. It used to happen, but now it's not just the misconception. A lot of startups like PixCaps, you guys are doing, offer great competitive package.
Yeah, so yeah, I think another thing is that I think increasingly a lot more employers are looking at the startup experience as a very, very positive thing. In fact, if I see a resume and they're from a startup working on a very interesting product, I tend to pick them over somebody who just came from Google and Meta, because I mean, let's face it, like you really go to Google and Meta for the brand name, but more often than not, I think a lot of people in the industry, especially hiring, we know that it's often just for the brand name and they don't really do very, very interesting things. Again, because there's just so many people in those companies, it's very hard to do something interesting, even if you wanted to, right? Unless you're a very, very top senior position, but then that's like a completely different ballgame. So most startups are hiring people who are relatively junior. Obviously, if you're hiring like a VP, it's a very different story, right? If you're hiring like a senior exec or VP, then yes, you might want more experience and people from like a larger company who has done it before. But for most startups at the early stage, you're hiring people at the junior level, right? People who can hit the ground running and execute and be hands-on instead of somebody who's like managing 100 people, right? So my advice applies to those startups, right? Startups in our position who are relatively early stage, hiring engineers, hiring marketers who may not have 10 years of experience in managing 100 people, but that's not what we're looking for at this stage because those guys are much later stage. Those are for growth stage startups, but early stage startups, seed stage, Series A, still looking for people who are much more hands-on and execution focused.
That's great. Thanks for the recommendation. I do think it's insightful for a lot of startup founders at early stage because you were there, you experienced the process. So the junior level, someone's willing to learn is the better right fit for the company. And besides that, do you have any other specific or just in general recommendation for some startup founders who are in the round of let's say seed round, Series A round, or what are the feedback or what are the recommendations you want to spread in that?
So you're asking what are the recommendations for hiring or?
Yep, you can tie it as specifically to hiring or in general, let's say in a bigger picture about running, growing and scaling and maintaining the startup in the long term. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting learnings that I've had recently, and I wish I'd done this earlier, is the importance of culture, right? So I think it's very easy for most startups because of inexperience. I mean, we made the same mistake to put culture as like an afterthought. Right. So culture is this cool thing, whatever, right? It's like this thing in the air. Well, actually it's not, because if you look at a lot of the best performing companies, they have an extremely strong culture. Culture is something that kind of like defines your company and who you are and values, but also it defines the kind of people you want to let into your company, right? So before that, without a culture, people would just kind of like do things the way they would do, and then there will be its own culture, but it's not the culture that you really want. So, for example, right, like if you're working with a team of people from, for example, like who are entirely based in Asia, and then so you want a culture of transparency, and you want a culture of promoting people and encouraging people to speak their ideas. It's much more difficult to pull that off in Asian speaking countries, again, because people have different culture. There might even be a language barrier, right? So having a strong sense of culture and having clear activities and reinforcing of that culture gets people to kind of like understand, okay, this is what you're looking for, and this is what I'm part of. And it also sets an expectation for everybody in the team to work towards, right? So if you don't really have a culture and you're just like, hey, let's do this remotely and do everything on Slack, but there's this missing element, right? People don't feel like they really belong, and people don't feel like they really need to express themselves. I mean, look, especially in a startup, you need to have a lot of more conversation, right? Because startups, there's a lot of things, a lot of iterations they need to do, right? A lot of things can change in the last minute. So it's more important than ever to really over communicate than under communicate, and having a culture that promotes that is extremely helpful. So yeah, I think culture is just very powerful and something that's often overlooked by startup founders. I know that we overlooked that part, but we implemented culture in late last year, and it's been like our team has been much better performing ever since.
Yep, I got the insight. So better start with culture, adaptability, and just alignment rather than just waiting for final stage like every companies are doing today. So go beyond it, right? I appreciate it. And I do think a lot of startup founders who are seeing this video have the same agreement, have the agreement with you coming to that. And before we drop off to any last thought you would love to spread the word out?
Last thoughts, I think, especially for most startups that are looking to hire remotely, I think the main thing that I would like, if you were asking me what is something that I would do over is again the culture thing, but also yeah, I mean, remote is like everybody is a bit different, right? So personally for me, I'm relatively like more in terms of like the way that I talk, and I'm very direct, but the way that you deal with everybody is not the same, and so. Hiring remotely, especially hiring from different parts of the world, you have to calibrate the way you motivate people and the way that you manage people. Because, for example, some people might be very direct and they appreciate directness, whereas other people might not appreciate that so much and they might actually feel hurt and upset. And so that's something that we had to learn the hard way as well, right? So, managing people, especially in a remote team, right? You don't really know how they feel, right? You can only see them through a video. So it's extremely important to calibrate some of the messaging and managing around people, especially if they're from different parts of the world. So some people, like that might just be who they are, right? They're just very soft spoken and they don't want to express themselves as much. That's totally fine, right? As long as they're performing well on the job. And similarly for somebody who's super direct, you might want to be more direct with them, right? And so one of the tricky parts is how do you manage an international team that has a very different culture, and even to some extent language barrier. And so, I think it's just really having a team that embraces diversity, but also at the same time being strict on the fact that everybody needs to use English as the main language in our case, and also the fact that they have to be extremely fast in terms of response times, right? Because you don't want to wait a day for somebody to respond, right? So that's something that's extremely important to make it work remote. Like just having the culture of like having people respond extremely quickly in a remote environment makes a 10x difference, right? So imagine if you send a message to someone and they take 1 day to reply, and then you take 1 day to reply, like things are not going to get done. And in a startup, that's extremely important.
Yep, got it. So just summarize the main few things you have mentioned. First is embrace diversity, accept the difference, but set clear expectations from the beginning to make sure that everyone is in the same page. And the second thing is culture, right? And third thing is responsiveness in the startup. So those three keywords are just very important in startup hiring.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, it sounds like common sense, but really, it's like in often it's not being done. Like I can tell you, like a lot of these are common sense, but a lot of startups don't actually work on these things until it's too late. Or I know in our case, like we made this mistake for 2 years. We didn't focus enough on culture. We compromised on our hiring, and we realized that that's a bad idea, right? Every hire that we've compromised on has ended up being bad fits. We might as well have started off and waited a bit longer for the right hire. So don't compromise on your culture and your values, and don't compromise on your hiring. Even if you really need a person badly, like yeah. So because in the long run, like startups are a marathon, not a sprint, right? As they call it. Assuming you have enough funding to be in a marathon. Yeah. So hire for the right people, and they'll make a 10x difference in your company. Like hiring is everything, right? So I think Steve Jobs said like recruiting is probably his single most important thing that he does, and he's one of his strongest skill sets. So yeah, recruiting is everything in a startup, right? Your first 5 to 10 hires will make or break your startup. So be very careful about who you let in, and make sure that the people that you let in, they are good fits for your culture, and make sure that you don't introduce any toxicity or negativity to your culture, and have people who always add energy into the conversation, especially if you're a remote team.
Yep, very great, very insightful, and a lot of things that seems like a gut, but not a lot of people could do so, right? CJ, so thank you so much for the valuable insights on hiring the right fit. I know our time is almost coming to the end, and I know that, just I appreciate your experience as well as the lessons, and should not say lessons, but the insights you have gained and shed light on the challenges faced by a lot of startup founders in today's world, and also the practical strategy you have shared to overcome those obstacles. So we hope that the AMA today has provided an opportunity to our audience to reflect on their own journey and achievement. And the wisdoms and the expertise has undoubtedly inspired those individuals and organizations seeking to hire the right fit candidates from the early stage. Thanks again for being here with us today, and we look forward to the opportunity of welcoming you back in the near future, experiencing your success in your own startup with more exchanges and knowledge, and just sharing sessions. And until then, we wish you all the best luck in your endeavors.
Thanks a lot, Mai. I hope this was helpful, and really appreciate this. I enjoyed it.
Thanks.